Chuck writes, I would be interested to learn about what is best practice for nonprofits in terms of bonus structures. I sit on a few not-for-profit boards where this has been a challenge. I know that it shouldn't be commissioned or numbers fund balance based. I would love to learn more about industry standards as it relates to this topic. So, Mike, this is an excellent question. There are a few different components to this. One, as Chuck mentions, is the structure of the bonus. The other is the amount, and kind of embedded in there is, what is the process for approving it, and how does this relate to, executive management contracts? Because I presume this is for an executive position. So lots of stuff to tackle on this topic of bonuses. What are your thoughts before I go with my legal perspective?
Sure, Ben. I think you and I will both, one, have come across this question many times. Two, there's actually a pre-question here, and we'll both look at it. But the pre-question here is, even if a bonus is appropriate for the organization at this time. And just to put that on the table, I'm sometimes a proponent more for, salary, performance-based salary increase, step increases versus, a bonusing. And that, so if, I know this is a ridiculous number, but if the bonus is $5, we have the choice to either run the $5 into the salary and spread it out, or even more, and that type of thing. And that's another whole discussion. But I just want to, because sometimes the bonuses, oftentimes are in place for a particular reason, and then there's the expectation that the bonus is going to continue year after year. And so I wanted to get that up front. And before we get into, not that bonuses aren't appropriate and how you structure them, but I just wanted to get that in up front. Is a bonus appropriate, and is it appropriate on a continuing basis, or is it a one-off?
Right. And when you see the stepwise increase, is that often performance-based, or is that budget-based, like the decision-making, or is it just kind of more automatic when you see that used?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of having a bonus, or a salary increase pool built into the budget, but it's at the discretion of senior management, except for the executive director, CEO position, which the compensation committee will be layered on top, to figure out how to allocate that. And that's usually bifurcated, and I'm okay with that. Bifurcated for a standard step increase, whether it's, cost of living or something that's across the board, and then something that's for performance, honoring commitments and such, some ability to be flexible in how that's allocated.
Yeah, it's challenging. And I've, of course, seen organizations that do both. They will look at increasing the salary every year, or however often the executive director compensation agreement rolls over. And there's consideration of a bonus sometimes, not with all organizations.
And that often happens. And I think of this, even though it's called a bonus, it's more of an award. If the bonus is on the smaller side, they're getting their step increase plus a performance increase in their base salary, and they're getting a end of the year, more like an award. You wouldn't call the bonus, a smaller dollar amount. So I think you can use these subtly, and then I think this is worth repeating. It's not a bonus for this year. It is a bonus for this year, but are you setting a precedence or a practice for years to come? Because it's hard to back off these things once you start the bonuses.
No matter what an organization says and the board says, this is discretionary one time, it's hard to resist that pull of like, okay, well, why not this year again? So it's, no matter what you do to make it clear that this is not meant to be always repeating, there is that pressure that's kind of hard to escape. But on the substance of the question, there's few different elements. So one is the question about the structure. So commissioned or number fund balance based, which I think means that it's based on hitting a specific revenue target and you get a percentage of that revenue, or fundraising a certain amount and you get it 5-10%, whatever the funds raised. I agree that that's not advisable, and there's IRS guidance that discourages that. I know some of the fundraising professional organizations, at least in the fundraiser space, discourage that. So I would say that's not a best practice for sure. Maybe done here and there, not necessarily illegal or prohibited if you do it within certain parameters like caps, but not something that I would recommend. What's your view on that, Mike?
Yeah. When I read the question, I totally understand the question, and in a perfect world, it wouldn't be. But the way I like to look at it, in evaluating someone's performance, you will be looking at numbers. But I think it's made clear that there are elements of a performance evaluation that you could look at dollar thresholds, like how well a budget year we had for a CEO, along
Yeah,
with what is member or donor satisfaction, which is hard to have a number on.
absolutely. Yeah, and there's a very fine line there. Obviously, these are factors. Obviously, the amount of fundraising that's brought in is going to be weighed pretty heavily by most compensation committees, most boards, how the organization is doing, just overall performance. It's a fine line between using that as a factor and then just agreeing that it's a flat percentage where there's a very
Exactly.
concrete tie. And I think that's the key. You don't want to have that very blatant percentage based tie to it. And what it comes down to, in my experience, there are probably some organizations that do it differently, but almost always I see discretionary based on a holistic assessment of performance. And the board, the executive committee, the comp committee will put all that together, discuss it, and just arrive at an appropriate number.
Exactly. But I think
Hmm.
when this is where IRS is getting at, they don't want to have automatic triggers.
Right.
We added 100 new donors. We hit a certain new threshold for fundraising. It's definitely going to be recognized in a bonus, but not an automatic trigger, because then you had
Right.
the manipulation of the numbers. We
Hmm.
tell a donor to hold off or not donate, or donate now and you can skip next year or something.
Right. And then to the legal permissibility, I think the IRS sometimes has issues with those specific triggers if there's not some kind of cap that ensures that the amount is always reasonable. And this may sound, if somebody comes from the for-profit sector, may sound a little counterintuitive, but if you have some percentage of fundraising with no upper limit, even though it's, hey, great for the organization that this person was so good that they brought in all this money, but if that results in them getting $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, that's something in a way that's disproportionate, there's going to be issues there. So the IRS, if that's ever used, it's kind of a must to have some kind of cap, but it's just kind of discouraged to have that be based on a specific trigger, specific percentage.
I agree.
And the rule here that everybody always needs to remember, no matter what the structure is that you arrive at, it needs to be reasonable based on the services provided, which is backed up by documentation and research into salaries paid by comparable organizations, uh, with comparable budgets in comparable geographic areas. So it always comes down to that. And part of that process needs to be evaluating the overall compensation, all of the benefits, lining it up with that research into the salary surveys and the other resources that are used to back that up, and ensuring that the executive is still within those limits, even when you factor in the bonus. So that's, as a matter of law, that's the key thing driving it. And then as a matter of fiduciary duties and responsibility, you want to make sure this is good for the health of the organization and be considering that.
And I think there's one element that brings that together, because you could check all those boxes, but I think what's very important is show that the compensation subcommittee or the subgroup or the board members that's looking at this, that they
Mm-hmm.
came to a answer through an analysis, a shared analysis process that is not driven by one person.
Well, that raises another question, not to send us too far down related paths, but there are IRS rules about compensation. There's a specific set of rules about getting a rebuttable presumption of reasonableness under the excess benefit transaction rules, and they have very specific requirements, which should be reflected in your conflict of interest policy and possibly also your compensation policy, your bonus policy, whatever else the organization has. And that ties in the analysis that the compensation, including bonuses, including benefits, including salary, is not more than reasonable, using appropriate comparability data, basing the decision on that, having the decision made by disinterested members of whatever the appropriate governing body, Mike, to your point. So be mindful of conflicts of interest on the board or the committee. If there's some outside business relationship or family relationship between the person being compensated. And also part of those rules is documenting the basis for the decision in the meeting records. So that's where there's a little bit of an art to that. You don't want the full deliberations all disclosed in the minutes, but you do want them to reflect that there was data that was viewed. You want to cite that data that was relied upon in arriving at the number, and then have the terms that were approved also in the minutes. So there, things get tricky a little bit in getting the appropriate amount of detail, but you want to hit that rebuttable presumption set of rules.
Exactly, Dan. But I also think you can less is more for me in the minutes, but that the minutes clearly reflect that there was a deliberative process, and there's a set of checklists, forms, whatever that were going in the personnel file or for the board discussion.
Yeah.
And that you just referred to that, but not to the details inside that report. We followed our procedures consistent with our internal practices and policies.
Well, in my opinion, the details of the data that was relied on should be there.
Okay, so I see where you're going, because for this, I'm always conscious of too much information in minutes, because they can be it's like someone taking a speech and pulling out pieces of it.
Right, and that's where these minutes need to have an especially careful eye.
Exactly.
You're not, don't rely on ChatGPT to generate these. There's legal consequences here. And this is one of those cases where the extra detail is a little more than you would put on most matters, but it's done for a very strategic, very specific reason. So that's got to be very carefully tailored.